Hello, this is the overview for the exclusive right to sell residential brokerage agreement. This is also called the listing agreement that is between the listing brokerage and the owner seller that is seeking to sell their property on the market. So just as a timestamp for this particular video, we are referencing the October 2024 version. So it should say copyright 2024, Maryland Realtors at the bottom. And I actually went to the statewide forms and it's showing last revised 1/7/2026. So make sure you're always using the most updated version of any contract or brokerage agreement. Make sure you put all of the seller's names. Anybody that is going to be on the deed is going to need to be on this listing agreement. And please put the broker information as well as your information as the listing agent. You're going to put the property address right here. You're going to put the broker right here. So for our brokerage, we would put Keller Williams Legacy or Keller Williams Capital Properties. And you are going to indicate first, the seller is going to verify if this property is owned in fee simple, so you would initial here, or if it is subject to ground rent, in which case you would initial here and put down the fee that is owed to the ground rent owner. Okay. We are required to have a start date and end date to this listing agreement. So make sure you have the date upon which the agreement becomes effective. And then it also has to have a expiration date, right? Importantly, there was an updated law recently which says the agreement may not be longer than 1 year in duration. So we are required, guys, should there be a delay and parties wish to extend this beyond 1 year, once you get to that 1 year mark, you actually have to execute a brand new listing agreement. You can't just keep continuing it past the 1 year mark. You need to re-execute a brand new agreement. You're also going to want to write in the terms of termination. This is another requirement in Maryland. Typically, I see that it's unilaterally terminable by either party as long as you provide sufficient notice. So you might write, unilateral termination with 5 days notice, but I always add the stipulation unless under contract. So if this is what you decide to write down, either party can terminate so long as they provide you with 5 days written notice. But once you're under contract, then it needs to be terminated by agreement, right? Because there are huge implications if you're under contract. An agent can't really abandon a client while you're under contract. In the same way, if the agent tries to fire you while you're under contract, there may be implications where you still need to get paid. So you need to really negotiate through that, involve your broker, and make sure that all parties agree to that termination. You're going to obviously put a list price. This is sometimes subject to change, and there are ways to formally change this down the line. But you want to, when you're getting your listing agreement signed, to make sure that you agree to some sort of a price to be put in section 5. For showing instructions, you just want to put down, this is where you have a conversation with the seller. It may be, hey, it's vacant. It's going to be go and show with a Sentry lock. It might be that, hey, we're only able to show it between the hours of 9 and 5. This is where you have the conversation about the method you're going to market showings and the type of security and ways that we're going to be able to get the key over to potential buyer agents. Okay, paragraph 7B here only applies if you're doing what's called an office exclusive. So basically, if you do not wish to have the property listing distributed on the MLS at all, okay? So they would initial here to instruct that the broker may not market the property on the MLS during the listing period. And this basically says why that's maybe a bad idea, how if you don't put on the MLS, you don't get all the eyeballs that you could. So if they wish for it not to be marketed on the MLS, you would initial here. Otherwise, you can just go ahead and leave this whole box blank, indicating that you do intend to market it fully. There's also some special provisions in section C here where they can instruct that we can't market the property on internet websites, or perhaps that we can submit it, but we can't have the property address on the internet. Okay, so these would be really niche, kind of hyper privacy concerned people. So if you're in a weird situation where you need to check off these boxes, just make sure that your buyer or your seller understands and make sure that you let your broker know. But for the most part, this section C is also going to be left blank because we typically do want this to be marketed in its fullest capacity, right? Okay. Section D, I like to think of as the sort of Zillow, Redfin, disclosures, that just things you're going to have to deal with. That if you want it to be disseminated to these websites, Zillow wants to be able to do their comment section, and Zillow wants to have their automated estimates where they use their AI to, provide these numbers. So if you want it to appear on some of these third-party websites, they need to check yes, they do authorize comments, and they do authorize automated estimates of market value. Section E references the coming soon status. This is just basically a pre-marketing option on the MLS where you can put up some pictures. You can show that the house will be coming on the market in the near future. But it's really, really important to note, you guys, that while we are in coming soon status, you are prohibited from showing the property. If anybody wants to actually come into the doors and see the property and do a proper showing, it needs to first be changed over into active status on the MLS. But make sure you have the conversation. I do think that it's helpful to do coming soon. So they would just initial here indicating that they understand what it is and that we're authorized to do coming soon, if that makes sense. Section F is about seller concessions. This is just indicating whether the seller wants to signal that they will consider offers requesting concessions. This is a non-binding sort of proposition. You can float out there that yes or no, they might be willing to think about concessions. In my experience, if a buyer needs a concession, they're going to ask for it, regardless of whether or not you check any of these boxes. But I usually encourage people to check yes, that they're at least willing to consider such requests. Okay, section 8 is the consent to discuss other properties when they're at an open house. So just make it really clear, you guys, explain what this is even talking about. If you, as a selling listing agent, is hosting an open house, their fiduciary duties are owed to you, the seller, right? You are working for the seller in that context. Other buyers might come by and say, hey, can you tell me about 123 Main Street? How does it compare to this one? So I do often encourage people to get the seller to authorize you to at least speak about other properties, with the understanding that the goal of the day and all of your duties are still owed to this client seller, not some random buyer that comes through the doors. But just make sure that the buyer, or whatever the seller decides here, you have to make sure that you honor their decision there. Make sure that you make it clear that in the event that the seller does have anything on the property that records audio, that all of that needs to be turned off for any type of showing. It is illegal without consent to record audio of anybody that might be in the house. Okay. Here is how you get paid. This is really important to have this conversation with your sellers so that there are no question as to who is being compensated, what triggers that compensation, and what is the amount of compensation. So we make it really, really clear. Each real estate brokerage independently sets their own rates. All rates are negotiable between seller and broker. Everything's negotiable. There's no such thing as a fixed amount. So just make sure that your sellers understand that. There are 3 different ways that you can get paid. You can either just charge a percent. Box number 2 is a percent plus some extra fee, or you can just charge some flat fee. And this is the total compensation that's to be paid to the broker. So I'm just going to put a hypothetical 6% here. Okay, say this is your fee. You charge 6%. You would just check the first box and say 6%. Let's say you decide you want to charge 5% plus a $700 fee. That is what you charge, 5% a $700 fee. Or maybe you were just a flat rate practitioner, say you pay me $10,000, I sell your house. That's what it costs. So you would just check box 3, put $10,000. Okay. This sets forth basically what triggers you being paid. And I always encourage you to put some number here. This is basically the let's be cool, don't screw me over paragraph, where you put in some provision here which would discourage and prevent a seller from suddenly firing their listing agent, cutting you out of the deal at the 11th hour, and trying to work a deal directly with the buyer and save on commissions. So if I bring you, if we're looking at if buyers are looking at your house over the course of this agreement, and I put in over the course of 90 days, even after our agreement is terminated, you can't sell it to anybody that looked at it during the brokerage agreement time frame, because look, this is a buyer that I brought to you essentially. You can't just fire me and get me out of the deal. So if you proceed to transact with that buyer, you still have to pay me. So this kind of makes sure that everybody is working together towards the greater good, and everybody's on the same team. Okay. Here's where we talk about cooperation potentially with other brokers on the other side of the transaction. So remember, in paragraph 14, we would put the total commission that is being paid by the seller. So I'm going to go with the initial box of, let's say it was 6%. All right, so 6% is the total fee. Then you can say, hey, in the event that a buyer agent brings us a buyer and that buyer proceeds to closing, are you willing, Mr. Seller, to compensate that buyer agent? So let's say they are, and they would say 2.5%, and you can break it down whether it's a sub-agent or a buyer broker. For the purposes of this conversation, we'll say it's 2.5% for either. Seller understands that compensating sub-agents or buyer's brokers is optional. Many sellers will find it in their best interest to offer this compensation, because otherwise the buyer may not, be able to afford their house at all. So this basically makes their house more affordable and more desirable if you can offer to compensate the buyer agent. Okay, so paragraph 14 is the total commission. Paragraph 15 is where some of it may be offered to the other side in the event that that other side brings a ready, willing, and able buyer that gets to settlement. The seller understands all these things, and they go ahead and initial there. Okay. There is a smoke alarm sort of pamphlet that's been circulating since 2018. It basically says that there are certain requirements that the seller must bring it up to some certain level of fire safety as it relates to smoke detectors and smoke alarms. So make sure that they are up to date. Make sure that just refer to that form as it relates to how old the property is and the type of protections that are in place, and just make sure that they are complying with those requirements and providing a home that is safe at the end of the day. If the house is built prior to 1978, that triggers a lot of extra disclosures. So first you need to basically indicate, the seller needs to initial stating that they understand if it was built prior to 1978 or if it was built after 1978. If it's built after 1978, you don't need to jump through all of the lead paint disclosure hoops. If it's built prior to 1978, or if they don't know when it was constructed, then that triggers the extra disclosures. Okay. This is also to say that in the event that it was built before 1978, there may be lead paint, and if certain renovations are actually required, then that will trigger certain levels of scrutiny or certain qualifications that a contractor might need. So just make sure that they understand that certain, EPA provisions may provide, and they would initial there. If the property is subject to what's called a deferred water and sewer assessment. So this is an extra bill that the owner of the property should be receiving, usually on an annual basis, that is basically owed to the developer because they spent a lot of money putting in sewer and water lines, and they put a lien essentially on the property that all future owners over the next, say, 30 or 50 years need to pay this developer some sum of money. So this is something that the seller should have actual knowledge of. It's something that it will be on the land records as well. So there's really no excuse for the seller not to know about this. And if they do have this, they have to disclose it. There's a special addendum that must be included. Now it says really clearly in big bold letters, if after settlement, if the buyer suddenly finds out that there was in fact a deferred water and sewer assessment that wasn't disclosed, the seller shall be liable to buyer for the full amount of any assessment not disclosed. So really, really important disclosure, guys. Make sure that your property owners understand this completely. They also need to check whether or not they authorize or do not authorize you to disclose existing offers. Personally, I love to be able to say, I have received an offer. Any agent interested must submit their best and final by some certain date, right? So without getting too deep into the negotiating nuance, I do find that it's helpful to be able to leverage the fact that you have an offer. So I do always encourage them to authorize you to make that disclosure, and make sure, guys, that you're complying with your ethical obligations to present to seller in a timely manner all written offers that you do receive. Please initial here if your broker does or does not offer a home warranty, and the seller gets to decide if they would like to pursue that. Okay. Paragraph 23 has to do with your disclosure and disclaimer requirements in the state of Maryland. Basically, 90+% of homes do have to complete this disclosure/disclaimer statement. Now, it does indicate that there are a few exceptions, right? If it's the initial sale of a new home, if there are certain foreclosure properties or sales that won't have the disclosure, there are certain estate sales that won't have the disclosure. So make sure that you read this provision really carefully to identify whether or not the home that you're selling is exempt from this disclosure law or is not exempt. Again, more than 90% of the time, you would check here that it is not exempt, and therefore you will have to fill out the disclosure disclaimer. Okay, if there are conservation easements, this is something that the seller needs to know about. So we rely on the seller to tell us either it is not subject to conservation easements, they would initial here, or that it is subject to certain easements, and they would go ahead and check off the appropriate easements. If the seller is a non-resident of the state of Maryland, there are pretty significant tax implications. Again, we are not CPAs, we are not accountants, but this is something that we need to make sure that they know about, right? Because if it turns out they're not Maryland residents, there may be big tax consequences, and there are ways to sometimes get an exception or to work something out with the comptroller of Maryland. So have the conversation up front, point out this paragraph so that they're not going to be surprised at the settlement table that they have some extra huge obligation that they weren't necessarily prepared for. We also need to know and disclose, guys, if there is a private or domestic water supply, or if there is not a private or domestic water supply. Really important that the seller checks that off so that we're able to give the proper disclosures. is the property near a Superfund site, which is basically a designated environmental disaster. They obviously need to disclose that, and that would trigger disclosure requirements to prospective buyers. And then there's all sorts of addenda here in paragraph 35 that will be a good checklist for you as a listing agent to make sure you go through this and say, oh, shoot, they have solar panels. I need to make sure to include that addendum and have the seller sign off. They're non-resident. The lead poisoning disclosures, the house was built prior to 1978. Just go through these, check all the appropriate boxes, and make sure the pertinent addenda are in fact attached. Sellers will sign and write the name of your brokerage, and then you, as the authorized representative of the broker, will go ahead and sign here as well. Now, at that point, you have a finalized and executed exclusive right to sell residential brokerage agreement. I hope this is helpful.